Okay, so thank you everybody for joining and getting on today. This is the 2026 Spring Colorado Grasshopper webinar, and this is a state webinar. So I will be going over everything from a state perspective instead of a county perspective. But if you have specific county questions, I can answer them as we go through this presentation. You're welcome to either put those questions in the chat as we go along, or at the end, there will be time for questions as well. So with that, we'll just keep going here. So if this is your first time joining a CSU Extension webinar, we just like to let you know that the university itself is an equal opportunity provider, and we don't discriminate on the basis of disability, and we're committed to providing reasonable accommodations. Really quick, your speaker today is myself, Beth Hayes. I'm the Pueblo County CSU Extension Agriculture and Natural Resource Specialist. I'm also the statewide Emergency Management Coordinator for CSU Extension as well. After this webinar, you all will get the recording of this link, and then what I'm also going to put in that email is all of the previous webinars I've done on this topic that go into a lot more detail for chemical application, for home gardens, things like that. So I will put a lot of those other webinars in that email, along with any of the fact sheets that I showed today. All of the past presentations that I've done are available for you all to look at. And then I will also be chatting about this 2026 GIS mapping project for landowners, which would be brand new this year. So as a quick overview of grasshoppers, so they're in the order they're similar to katydids and crickets. They're cousins to those. So similar insect, but not the same damage when we think of katydids and crickets. Grasshoppers, for the most part, are annual insects. Some of them can overwinter as nymphs, and we're going to talk about that a little bit because we're seeing some of that change in our state overall. And the way that they do that is they use sugar as a type of antifreeze in their blood. But most of our species that we deal with typically overwinter as eggs, and this nice description you see here on this slide shows you the eggs overwintering here in the soil and then popping out and going through their molting stages until eventually they have wings, which then they're an adult, and then they go back into laying eggs and the process starts over. So this just shows you a quick overview of that. And then everyone always asks, do they actually serve a real role in our ecosystem? Because they're very annoying, they cause a lot of damage. They actually do. They serve as decomposers, and they're part of the food chain when we think of a overall ecosystem view. In grasshopper species, females are always larger than the males. So when we think about management, you always want to look at, if you get into this a little bit late and you're looking at trying to identify which ones you really want to target, you want to target the females because those are the ones laying the eggs and doing the future work, because it's a long-term management topic, not something you can do in one season. So you really want to target the females, which are always going to be larger than the males, regardless of species. So if you see two bright green grasshoppers, the bigger one is always going to be the female. They don't have territories and they don't socialize outside of mating behavior. It doesn't mean that they can't congregate and all be in one area if they're particularly feeding, but they don't move as one hive mind. They do move as individuals, which is a key factor in between grasshoppers and locusts that we'll kind of get into. Temperature and precipitation matters most when they're young, and we'll get into that. And then early management is the biggest takeaway I want you guys to take away from all of this, is that the earlier you can manage them, the more successful you're going to be throughout the entire growing season, regardless of what plants you're trying to protect. So with that, let's go over their life cycle and some other facts. So in the around the world, there's around 11,000 species. In Colorado, there's around 133, give or take. We're seeing that more and more kind of jumping into our borders from states that touch us from different sides. And just last year, there were 15 brand new species found in the South. So this number is changing and growing. So just because you think you've seen all the grasshoppers, I'm willing to bet you probably haven't. And if you see something that you haven't seen before, it is worth reporting, just because we are trying to track them, how they are moving across the Western United States, and if new species that we've not seen in our state are moving, but there's still a lot of species out there. So just because it's something you haven't seen before doesn't necessarily mean it's not a common Colorado species. Eggs are laid in the soil or late summer They're laid in the soil in late summer, early fall, and these are what the eggs kind of look like. And then they hatch typically in March or April, generally, but that's very weather dependent, and we're going to talk about that. Everyone asks, can I find the eggs in the soil? For the most part, no. They're pretty much hard to see with your naked eye. They're very small, they're rice-shaped, they're in clusters for the most part, and they roughly measure between 4 and 9 millimeters. They can be in clusters of 10 to over 100 plus per clutch. Some of them do bury them in the soil about an inch or two down, while others stick them under leaf litter that is just around your yard in that fall, early winter. Some of them may also like stick them under branches or like down nooks of a tree root. So they can be hidden because they just are trying to give them some protection from any potential winter weather that could freeze them and then pop them. So once spring hits and they start hatching, they come out of these eggs, they pop out of the ground, and then they start going through this molting stage. Now, most grasshopper species molt between 5 and 6 stages, but this whole time while they're molting, they're not considered an adult. An adult grasshopper has fully formed wings and can fly, while a nymph cannot fly. It doesn't mean they don't have wings, it just means they're not fully developed. So they can't actually fly even if you do see wings. This is super important for management because you're gonna need to know how you wanna spend your money. Some of the items that you spend your money on only work on nymphs, others work better on adults, and vice versa. So it's really, really important to be able to tell the difference between a nymph and an adult, regardless if you're gonna use chemicals or a more organic option, because otherwise you're just gonna wind up spending your money frivolously and the bugs are going to laugh at you. As far as like this whole molting stage goes to where they come out of the eggs and then how long does it take them to reach an adult, for most of our species statewide, it's around 45 to 54 days. That's not a lot of time. That's about 5 to 6 weeks like of total like growth, and then especially it's also very weather dependent, and we'll talk about that, but 45-54 days, like it's pretty fast. So you really want to be out there scouting, especially when you first start seeing them in those top 5 to 6 weeks. That's when you're going to have the most success with management. And then only the adults, the ones that are fully formed, those are the ones that lay eggs in our late fall. Between September and November, it kind of varies by species of exactly when they're going to do that, and you can see early mating behavior happening before September, but they're not actually going to be laying any eggs until at least September. So we'll talk about that. All right, so everyone asks, are the grasshopper plague levels we're seeing, are these locusts? What does this mean? So in the United States, we actually haven't had locusts since the 1800s, which is great news for us, but they do exist in other places around the world. The other big takeaway is that all locusts are grasshoppers, but not all grasshoppers can become locusts. There's 11 identified species of grasshoppers that can become locusts. And what that is, it's a biological change. So it's a change in their DNA. And this picture from Texas A&M is a really good example of that. So the one on the left, this brown looking color, this is a grasshopper. The one on the right, the bright yellow one, that is a locust. They are the exact same species of grasshopper, but you can see that there was a huge change in how it looks. Its wings are bigger, they get larger teeth, longer wings, they change in color, and then they also become a hive mind. So like I said before, when they're just grasshoppers, they move as individuals. They might congregate in one area because of food sourcing, but they don't really care about the other grasshoppers around them outside of mating behavior. When they are a locust, they move as one entire body, which is another big distinction when we get into the conversation about Mormon crickets. So just know that is what a locust is. It actually is a DNA change. It can be affected by geographic weather, area, and then the species count. And among the 11,000 known species, like worldwide, 27 of those can become locusts. But in Colorado, we only, the USDA APHIS team tracks 11 species that can become locusts in our state. It is mostly triggered by drought, heavy populations crowding, and then the rise of serotonin that happens when they're all getting together. And then when one of them gets triggered to become a locust, it starts a chain reaction, and all of them do that. So there is a group that watches this. It's called the Locust Watch. It's the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. And that one tracks them across the world. They have maps available that you can see, kind of track all those populations. It's pretty interesting. But we do not have any here. And the last one that really affected us here in Colorado was the Rocky Mountain locust. And the last one we've seen alive was in 1902. So just know that even if we see high levels again this year, which we're likely to, They're not actually locusts, they're still grasshoppers. So talking about that, I want to talk about this really important resource, which is the hazard map that the USDA APHIS puts out. Now, this really looks at the United States on a Western focus. And so what this does is it looks at all these different states, and here is Colorado, right here where my mouse is. And this was in 2024 when we really started having bad grasshopper impacts, where we're talking like billions of individuals. The darker the color on these maps, the worse it is in population. So like all this red you see in Montana, extremely bad. If it's blue, it's pretty managed, and it's more of just like they're there, but they're not really causing huge damage in economic or agriculture value. And then as we go down in color, the worse it is. So I just want to point out that for the red areas, like we saw in our state, it's 15 plus, which equals 15 plus adults for every square yard they count. And that equals to 9.2 million acres for every red area you see, which is really large. I also want to point out these maps are done only on public land. USDA APHIS counters are not allowed to go on private land. So all of this you see is only capturing what they can publicly go count on. So this is a accurate map from a public standpoint, but doesn't always capture the full picture of what you guys are seeing on your private land. So I just wanted to give a reference of where we were in 2024. And then this was 2025. So we saw, we had a bigger explosion here on the eastern side, where I'm stationed here in the southern part of the state. Saw very heavy numbers, but again, it was mostly on private land. We didn't have a lot of it on public land, but it was very, very heavily noted on private land, sorry. And then this is Colorado and the map that they have put out as an estimation for 2026. Again, some hot spots we see here in the far northeast portion of our state, and then again, right here at our border of New Mexico, which is likely that they could spread and get into like Los Animas, Huerfano, Pueblo, Trinidad, like all of these counties. A lot of the valley could see that as well, just because they will migrate, especially because New Mexico is a lot drier than we are as a state. So it's really good to know. So just take this map with a grain of salt, knowing these counts are done on public land and it's not capturing the impacts having on private land, which is where that GIS mapping project I mentioned earlier is going to come into play this year. So the other way that they do counts is they look at this at a county by county basis, and then they apply it to a big, large map. So remember, nymphs are our ones that can't fly. They do not have fully developed wings. And again, on this map, same concept. The darker the color, the worse we are. So on this one, as you can see, Pueblo got hit hard with nymphs, our adult ones. Los Animas had some hot spots. Up here again in the northeast where we saw it. Route had a few that were also seen as well. Not so much in our mountain areas, but it doesn't mean that you guys weren't seeing them. It just means that they weren't there where they were counting them. So again, make sure to just keep that in mind as we go through with these maps. And if you want to see your county ones, these are available where we can send these out. So if you want to see like the deep down of where they were, finding these hotspots on public land in your county, these are available, and I will make sure they are in the email that we send out. So then this is the adult survey. Again, same process. Darker the color, the red ones are really the hotspot areas. Yellow and green aren't so great. Blue means it's pretty manageable. There's not that much of a damage. The gray ones mean they didn't find any worth reporting. So again, you can see we're seeing the highest numbers here really on the south and the eastern side. I see the question about higher elevations. They can be at higher elevations, but the biggest problem is that there's so much forest land here in this open section of the map that the counters have a tough time getting in there to do accurate counts. So it doesn't mean that they don't have big population pockets. It's simply because of the way the funding works for the counters that come out of USDA APHIS to do these areas. So it doesn't mean they're not there. It just means that the federal people weren't able to report anything. So that is a good question that I did want to answer in time because it's very relevant to the maps. Okay, so moving on here, I do want to talk about Mormon crickets because there has been a further explosion of them in our state, and I met with the USDA APHIS representative for Colorado a few weeks ago, and he did let me know that New Mexico had a really bad explosion of Mormon crickets, and they have since moved up across the state lines and is now impacting Colorado. This is a pretty big deal because Mormon crickets are in the same order of insects as grasshoppers, but they move as a hive mind. So they actually have an impact in the millions or billions because of the way they move, versus remember, grasshoppers move as individuals. So this is kind of a really big deal. So they have faster grow rates, they have a smaller body size, they don't have wings, which is the big deal, so they can't fly, they do hop, and they can have huge egg banks in the valleys of mountains. So like elevation is like less of a deal if a pocket gets started for these Mormon crickets, which is really bad. So their ideal temperature range for movement is a little lower than grasshoppers. Grasshoppers start moving around at 80 and above that. Mormon crickets will start moving around at 65 and higher, and then they're most active in the mornings between when temperatures are 80 to 90. If there's higher temps up in our state in general, including in higher elevation, there will be less eggs. So that's the one nice point about them. A lot of people freak out about this spike that's here on the backside of their body. This is purely for laying eggs. It's not used as a defense mechanism or anything like that. It's simply just for a deposit for eggs. We see outbreaks in years where there's low rainfall and drought, like what we're all experiencing now. Excessive moisture is a good thing for us because on them, it inhibits egg hatching, it lowers their population growth, and it delays nymph development, which is huge. And then they stay inactive during wet or cold weather, which again, we're greatly missing in our state. So this is kind of a big deal and a new threat that's starting to impact a lot of us. So I just want to show you, so this is the 2024 survey they put out. They don't put population counts to them because they will always be like in the millions. There's no point in saying how many there is per square yard because if there's a circle, it's bad. So in 2024, they were just counted up here in the northwest corner of Moffat, Rio Blanco, and Garfield. So this is where they were heavily seen, kind of a big issue. Everywhere else in the state, not really seen, not really worth mentioning. This is the 2025 map that came out. You can see that there's this nice cluster here in Custer, Pueblo, and Huerfano. Talking with the USDA APHIS folks, they feel strongly that the Valley, Los Animas, and Baca will probably also see high populations of Mormon crickets this year that previously have not existed because New Mexico didn't do a whole lot of treatment and they just jumped the state lines. So just something to keep aware of, that they are moving in the southern portion of the state and they can easily spread, especially because drought and warm weather are their best friends, which is a lot of what our state is seeing. So I just want to show this quick video that was posted by AccuWeather about why they're so bad. And I'm going to turn the sound off because the sound doesn't matter. Those are all Mormon crickets. This is how they move as a population. There's, I mean, hundreds of thousands. You can see that she has her shoes covered in plastic bags because they will crawl on you. You're not going to be able to get in a building without stepping on hundreds, thousands, a lot of them. You can see like they only hop. They don't fly like grasshoppers do. And they're solid like grasshoppers when they reach adult form. So, you know, it's just a bunch of crunching as you walk in. So that's just a quick video of why it's really important that you're monitoring for those and you know how to deal with them. When we start talking about chemical applications, there's only 3 chemicals that work for Mormon crickets versus there's 4 chemicals that work well for grasshoppers. So if you do see a spike in Mormon crickets in your area and you're wondering what do I do, those resources I will also put in the larger email that will go out to everyone next week. So I just want to talk about last year what we saw. So we did see high numbers last year, which is what we thought because of the hatching rates, but it wasn't as bad because they started really early hatching in 2024 and they had a little bit later hatching last year because of the weather we saw. This year, they're hatching early again because there's been no moisture. We really didn't have a winter and our state is nice and dry. So this is June. This was June here in Pueblo. You can see it was a heavy, this was on private property on a ranch. And so, you know, we saw pretty high infestation levels that weren't noted on that map. So we know that this area is probably going to be another big hotspot because most of those were able to lay eggs or overwinter at nymphs and cause big population spikes again. We saw pretty early mating. Normally, again, like I said, we typically don't see mating until like August behavior, but if you see the really big one on bottom and then you see the smaller one on top, that's a mating pair, and the bottom one is the female. So the minute you see that, you know that most of them have completed their complete adult stage. They're already starting to mate, and they might even start depositing eggs early, depending on how early you saw that, even before September, which is a pretty big deal. We did notice less diversity last year than in 2025, but it doesn't mean we won't see it this year just because they're being pushed out from the other states that are even drier than we are, from our different corners of our state. So, all right, so talking about this year so far, from the field reports I have seen, things I've personally gone out and seen for a large portion of the state, there are more species that are coming into our state overwintering as nymphs, meaning that they aren't coming out as eggs and hatching and doing that normal cycle. They are showing up as like medium-sized grasshoppers and then popping out and immediately getting to town, eating in large quantities, and quickly moving on to adult stage, which is a big problem for us because our plants aren't ready to handle that kind of damage. So this is a big deal. There was a lot of federal funding cuts last year, and that limitation of public land counts means that we're likely to see high numbers again in areas that were heavily infested last year, just because they weren't able to get an accurate count, and there was just not enough people to go around to do that service. So just know that even if your county isn't necessarily in the red zone, doesn't mean you won't see a high number. The southern counties like Pueblo, Huerfano, Colorado Springs, those in the valley, have already seen fully grown adults and even fourth stage molted grasshoppers in the last 3.5 weeks. So it is already happening and can tell you they're coming out, which means you need to be diligent about what are you going to do from a management perspective. Now let's talk about weather impacts, because that's a big deal, especially now in our state. So if we get springtime rain, and then fall and heavy like August rain, that is a big deal because it will slow down in the springtime. It can kill first instar grasshoppers, which is based off their wing pad size. So that's like that first, second molt, depending on species. And then in the August, in the fall, it can impact maturity rates and then how well the female can lay eggs. So if we get good moisture, specifically rain in May, and then like August, September, we're looking in pretty good shape. However, if we don't get good moisture at all, that we're gonna be in a tough spot again. The slower we warm up as a state delays their hatching. Unfortunately, we know that's not happening this year. It's gonna mimic more of what we saw in 2024 than what we saw last year in 2025. The higher moisture and humidity there is in the air, the better there is of a natural control of horsehair worms, which gets into the grasshopper. This is a horsehair worm. It's a type of parasitic nematode that impacts them and really lowers their population. However, these only exist when there's higher humidity and moisture, which again, we're just not seeing. The minute we really start getting warm, which we've already done, that's when their populations bloom because they're triggered by a heat index. So that's really what it does. I get a lot of questions of, is this normal? What is happening? So studies have shown in Colorado that we have had major epidemics before noted by this map, and it's been about every 22-year intervals. And then there's been smaller outbreaks around every 11 years. People ask, so are we gonna like have this year where we just drop down like what we saw here in 1940? Probably not, because of the way that our weather is sitting right now. It's probably gonna be more consistent like here around like the 1950s, 1955, where you see these like little spikes happening. That's probably more of what we're going to see until we get back to a more consistent cycle of hard, cold winters and heavy spring and then monsoon season in the fall with our rainfall. So until we really kind of get back to a little bit more of that cycle, it's going to be where we do see these really high spikes and steady concentration of high numbers instead of them dropping off like they should naturally just because of the weather. So really quick, I want to mention the Colorado Drought Monitor. Same thing like on grasshoppers, the darker the color, the worse off you are in drought. I did talk with the District 10 Water Commissioner yesterday, and they have stated that they do feel like this map is a little bit behind, that a lot of these places are a lot more dry than what is noted right now on the Colorado Drought Monitor. So we're likely to see the whole portion of our state probably sit at a D3 or D4 in the next month or so. So just be aware of it, that just because the Drought Monitor, claims that our areas where we're likely to see high infestation aren't in a big drought, we really are if you live in these places, which means that it's prime weather for grasshoppers, unfortunately, because there's a direct correlation there. So these graphs here are taken from the National Weather Service Climate Prediction Center, and they looked at Colorado for a 3-month outlook. Well, it looked at the western states, and I just kind of zoomed in. The block here, this is Colorado. So this is temperature. And again, anything in the like dark reddish colors are anything above normal. Blue would be below normal. We're seeing everything above normal. So here we are, March, April, May. They were saying that for most of us, we were going to be like 33 to 40% above normal in temperature. April, May, June, kind of where we're sitting at now, we're looking at being anywhere between 40 to 50% above normal. And then as we get later, when our summer season really starts to kick off, we're looking at being at that 50 to 60% above normal in temperature, which again, if you guys remember from earlier when we talked about how does their biology match with weather, the hotter it is, the faster they grow, the more hatchings we're likely to see. So for this, it means most likely it's going to be on par with a lot of hatchings, a lot of grasshoppers, a lot of movement, unfortunately. So then let's talk about precipitation. So again, low rainfall, they love it. That's when they also love to thrive. In this one, the green means we're above normal in precipitation, and then the brownish, tannish color is below normal. This is from the same set of graphs from the National Weather Service. Again, here, March through May, we're looking at between 40 and 50% below. April, May, June, sitting about in that same spot for most of us. But then there's a chance, May-ish, we're a little bit better. And that is because of the impacts of what everyone is calling a potential super El Nino. Now, if you've been tracking the weather at all, you know that we've been in La Nina, and now we're going to switch to an El Nino. And then what does that mean for Colorado? So in basic terms, when we switch to El Nino, this is a huge natural climate pattern that affects the entire world, not just the United States or Colorado. But it begins in the tropical Pacific Ocean, and it causes the sea surface temperatures near the equator to become warmer than average. A super El Nino means that those sea temperatures are going to be even higher than what they see in an average El Nino, which means that these bands of like warm and wet could be a little whiter than what we see on like a typical map that was given here by Fox 21 a couple weeks ago. So for a super El Nino, there's a bigger chance that a lot of our state could see a lot more moisture, and we could get some snowstorms in the mountains for those of you that are at higher elevation, and those of us that are not could see this come down as rainfall. So there's a good chance, they're saying, that we could see this. But this is a very complex system with a lot of factors to it, so it's hard for them to say exactly when we'd see that type of moisture or how much. So if we do get this awesome, super fantastic El Nino and grasshoppers, what does that mean? So it will lower our temperatures, which is fantastic, meaning that the ones that we have already, it's going to slow down that growth rate, it's going to slow down their molting stages, and you won't have as many hatchings that start out in that early season when your plants are first trying to get a good grip on what's going on. That late April, early May, these are like nymphs that you can see here. This is a picture from Utah State Extension. These are a lot of them trying to hide from the rain. If we get big, fat, thick, heavy raindrops and it stays like that for a couple hours, or maybe if we're lucky a full day in some places, this will kill these guys. They can't get away from it. Their bodies are still super soft and they'll drown. So big, heavy, thick raindrops will knock a lot of these guys off and they'll drown, and it'll be fantastic. And if we get that, if we do get an El Super Nino, this could actually also push the natural populations to go more into that larger cyclical pattern that I showed you guys earlier than the steady holding pattern with high populations that we've been seeing for the last couple of years. So if El Nino plays nice with us, there's some good chance that this year may not be as hard, but it's hard to say exactly when we'll get that and if we'll get that. So it will be interesting for sure. So when you guys start thinking about management, I just want to put this out here about hatching temperatures. So when we predict hatching for grasshoppers, you need to know when dipause, which is that state of suspended animation, is brought on by temperature, when that stops, and then when the eggs are actually going to have more of that embryonic development. For most of the species, we're seeing that these are different grasshopper species here, days to hatch. And then this is temperature, here's Fahrenheit, here's Celsius. For this purpose, we're going to just focus on Fahrenheit. That for most of these, they're hatching around between 59, 77 degrees, which a lot of us have been seeing already, meaning right now you guys have probably been seeing a lot of them that have been hatching or are about to hatch if you've been lucky enough to stay a little cooler, which means you really need to start scouting now, doing some management options before it gets too late, because again, you only really have 54 to like 45 to 54 days to really get them, and then it's full grown adulthood and it's too late. So okay, so when we talk about the growth, here's where you can really see the instars that I talked about that go along with our molting stages. Now, these are based off species, so the size looks a little different, but it's important to know them. So the first instar, it's very small. Second instar, it's a little bigger. Third, we can actually see the wing pad come down. Fourth, there is a wing pad, but it doesn't go past that first abdominal segment. And then fifth, there is a full-grown wing there that comes out there by their abdominal segment. So this is really important, because if you're going to apply for any kind of state funds for grasshoppers or anything that a conservation district may be doing, they're going to need to know, one, what life stage are they at? And you're going to need to be able to say what instar stage they're at. So you're going to have to be able to tell them based on what it looks like compared to this model. And then you're going to have to measure. The other big thing that you have to know in order to get funding for a lot of these programs is species, okay? And there's a couple big things to keep in mind. So for species in Colorado, there are these three big families that I've denoted here: slant-faced, spur-throated, and banged-winged. Those are our three big families. There's subcategories of species in all those three, but being able to just start putting those into one of those three saves you a lot of time. And there's tools that help you with this that we're gonna walk through. So these are the big three. These are pictures of them. So slant-faced, it looks exactly like what it sounds like. Their faces are extremely slanted. There's an extreme angle to them. For those of you that have taken in-person classes with me on grasshoppers, I have examples of these that I have kept, and their faces are extremely angled. If you can look at that picture compared to the other two, they have very kind of rounded faces. These guys are extremely at an angle. So the quickest way, if their face is really angled, it's slant-faced. For spur-throated, the biggest thing is when you flip them over, that little notch right here where the arrow is pointing, that's the spur they're talking about on their throat. So that is the spur-throated one. And if we go back a slide, they start out as green nymphs. Now they can be a variety of green, but just as long as it's green and it's got that spur on it, it's a spur-throated grasshopper. So, that's a big one. And then banged wing, they're one of the really big classes as well here in Colorado. They're bright red or yellow hind wings as an adult. You see this guy has big yellow hind wings as an adult. They can be seen as adults in early spring because they can overwinter, and then nymphs in late summer because they're those adults that overwintered are then laying eggs, and then you can have a later hatching cycle. So just know that these guys, you might see them in a slightly different hatching season than these other two, just because of the way that they developed as a species. But knowing these three is huge in order to get funding from the state or from a local program that might be going on in your area. So how in the world do you ID? Because everyone's like, oh my gosh, there's 133 plus species in our state, right? And then we've seen that they're moving into our state from other areas. How do I know? Well, I put this really nice slide together for you guys. So you want to do the method called capture, kill, measure. So capturing, the easiest way to capture them is using a butterfly net. And the smaller the screen is on the net, the better. You don't want a big one because one, either they're going to get out if they're small, or two, if it's like big, they'll just kind of chew one strand and be able to fall out. So the smaller the size on the netting is, the better. And you don't want to put the net from the top down on top of them, because if you think of the way grasshoppers move and the way that their eyes work, they're always looking up above them for predators, right? So really what you want to do is you either want to come from the side and do a sweeping motion, or if you can, like sweep and go down so that the net naturally falls on top of them, so that you get as many grasshoppers as you can. Then you want to put them, there's two really big ways to do this. So you can either put them in like in a jar, a bucket, a gallon-sized Ziploc bag, and you can put them in your freezer. I would highly recommend freezing them for at least 4 to 8 hours. We have some species that will reanimate, meaning they come back to life if you only freeze them for a day. So if you go to put them all in your freezer and then you take them out the next day in order to measure and do all this in order to get some funding money, it might start hopping around on you and get away, and then you wasted all that time and effort for nothing. To make sure they're really dead, you can keep them in for 3 days. There hasn't been a species that I've interacted with or the USDA has interacted with in our state that can handle being frozen for over 3 days. So if you're like, I don't even want to deal with the chance of them being zombie grasshoppers, give them 3 days. They won't be able to come back. But I highly encourage you to put date, location, and the plant they were on, because sometimes when you freeze them, depending on what temperature range your freezer is set at, it can deteriorate the color of the grasshoppers when they start to thaw, which means that you might not be able to easily identify, and you may not remember what color they were when you put them in there, because maybe it's been a week and you went on vacation, right? So knowing what plant they were on can also really help you identify them. The other way you can kill them is you can put them in a jar, a sealable jar like a mason jar, and put a cotton ball that has isopropyl alcohol in it. Now, if you do this, you can't stuff the jar full of grasshoppers because of the way that the gas has to settle. You can really only, like if they're big grasshoppers, I wouldn't put in more than like 5 to 7. If they're tiny guys, you could get away with like close to 10. But you're going to kind of have to watch that because it's all about density, because you're creating a gas chamber in there, and that is what kills the grasshoppers. So just keep that in mind. You can do that, and then it does keep their color a little bit better than the freezing, but sometimes freezing is just a little bit more convenient. And then once you have that and they're deceased, then you want to take them out and have a ruler, because now you're going to have to measure those wing pads and what everything else looks like. This tool is the ID tool for grasshoppers of the Western United States. When you click on this, it will ask you, is the grasshopper you collected a nymph? And remember, they can have wings, but they can't actually use them. Or is it an adult, which is a fully formed grasshopper? It can fly, it makes noise when you hear it. And then it will ask you, how long is the wing pad? Where did you find it? It lets you do it by state. It says, what county are you from? What was it eating? It will ask you the shape of its face, the colors you see on it, everything. And then it will be able to tell, based off what information you give it, what species it is. So there is this fantastic tool that does the hard work for you. All you have to do is capture, kill them, and have some measurements on hand so you can put this into the tool. Super, super helpful. These are some other ones you can like put in, but there's hundreds of items it asks you about to really narrow down what is the main specific species you're looking at out of those 3 big subfamilies, okay? So that's really helpful. And again, this will all be in the further email. I'm also going to put this in the chat when we get done here, and I stop sharing my screen, so if you guys want to play with it, you can. The other big piece with grasshoppers is that you're looking for an acceptable threshold. You're not going to be able to get rid of all of them. That's just the way it is. There's just too many of them to honestly do that from an insect management perspective. So our goal is never eradication, it's management. And this little line here was supposed to be here because we're looking for management, not eradication. This really nice picture from the University of Nebraska, Lincoln, shows us that when you have a population that's anywhere honestly above 30%, you're gonna not have any plant life left. The plant cannot recover, it cannot handle this level of pest infestation. You really want to aim for like 20% and lower is what you're aiming for with population management with grasshoppers. The USDA has a threshold on it of like for 15 to 20 nymphs per square yard is damage issues, you got to do something, and then 8 to 10 adults per square yard is the other big, like you have way too many, you're going to have to do something. So that's just key numbers to keep in mind. I also want to point out, this is like an example of an egg cluster. It's very small, it blends in with the dirt, you know, it's smaller than the dime we have here in the photo. So just be aware that finding these eggs are almost next to impossible with the naked eye. And it does matter going after the females, or at least disrupting their ability to lay fertile eggs that are going to make it in our state, because as you can see, there can be around 25 egg pods, and there's 4 to 40 eggs per pod. there's 100 to 200 eggs in each pod as a potential number in a female, which is a lot. Like if we think about that, that's a lot of eggs per grasshopper per female when we look at those threshold numbers, especially if you remember that earlier video where I walked through the field and there's just hundreds of those, and at least 50% of those are females. All right, so you're like, okay, now I know how to ID them, I know how to capture and kill them, but I need to know my threshold count, right? And so that you guys know how much you want to do from a management perspective. So you have to stop, look, count, and collect. This is a reference to a sheet of how do you do this. It's called a visual count from the Grasshopper biology and monitoring sheet. And again, I will email this out so you guys have it, and it walks you through how to do this. One of the biggest times of this piece is knowing temperature. Grasshoppers are very temperature specific on when they're going to move. So ideal counting temperature and ideal management temperature for grasshoppers is that 60 to 95 degree range. For most of us, they're not going to really be active until it's at least 80 degrees as far as movement goes. The wind has to be less than 15 miles per hour. And if things are super wet, like if it's about to rain or it just rained, they're really not going to move around. You're not going to get an accurate count. So the way this works, you look at a square yard in front of you, right? And then I have pieces of paper here, and if you're in Pueblo County or around Pueblo County, you're welcome to come get them that are a perfect square yard that show you how to count. You look at that in front of you, and then you walk towards that. When you get to that square yard that you looked at in front of you, you want to count every grasshopper that flies or jumps out of that square yard. And you want to kick the grass around in that square yard to see how many come out. Anything that doesn't fly counts as a nymph. Anything that does fly when you get in there counts as an adult. If any grasshoppers move into your square yard while you are moving and counting, they don't count. You only want to count the things that come out of the square, not into it, okay? And you want to do this in a certain pattern. It depends on how big your area is to figure out what is the average of a certain area. Now, if we are talking like thousands and thousand acres, you really want to go for where they're the most dense. Don't worry so much about areas where they're not super dense. You might see like a couple as you go through the field, but it's nothing intense. I wouldn't worry about those. Go near the roadways, near your fence lines, near high pasture areas that you know that they're most likely going to be intense. That's where you really want to monitor. That's where you want to do these counts, okay? And then there's some math you have to do, but it's basically adding it up and doing an average. Again, it lays it out more in the sheet that I'll give you guys through email. Or if you're nearby to me, welcome to come up and pick up a sheet from the Pueblo CSU Extension Office. All right, so once you know all that, you know your species, you know your threshold count, what can you do? So there is a statewide program. Now, this program only works on rangeland, and there's a section that kind of mirrors that count map where they won't spray at all because it's too dense with trees and they just can't get the planes in the way they need to. But they have those maps. They can tell you whether your area is one they can or cannot spray. But you have to submit a written request to them early. You have to be able to identify your species and then know your life cycle stage. If it meets the requirements they're looking for, then they will agree to do the program for you and come and spray for property management. But it's really based off acreage. So the larger acreage size you have, the better off you are in getting help from the federal program for this. This is our contact for Colorado. His name is Elver. Again, this will be available. I'll also put it in the chat. You guys are welcome to email him. He's aware I'm doing this webinar, and he would also like to say if you guys have any further questions that I can't answer, they can tackle them as well. So again, I'll put his contact info in the chat, and you guys will have it in the email. This one was just like an example of the aphis treatment that they did in 2025 with some info to kind of give you guys an idea of a cost basis and the different pesticides they use. So it's typically a plain spray program that they use, and they do it in what is called a rat program that we'll talk about here in a moment. So this is a plain only spraying option. This is not something they do by hand on the ground. It's plain only if you contact them. Some conservation districts I know throughout the state were looking at doing sprays on like right-of-ways and ditches and things like that would manage some of the larger hotspots. So you might reach out to your conservation district to see if they are going to put a program like that together and how much it would cost and what all that looks like. So just know there might be some county ones that have decided to get together and do that. Okay, so let's talk about some options for rangeland pastures, cropland, home gardens, and I'm going to talk about trees. So For rangeland coverage, the RAT program works really well, which is done by, one of the aerial sprayers like we see here. RATs stand for Reduced Agent and Area Treatments. It's a method of integrated pest management that looks at the rate of insecticide, which is reduced from traditional levels where you're just like attacking everywhere, and it leaves untreated areas that are alternated with treated sections. So if you think of like quilting or weaving, there's an area of untreated, and the ones that border it on either side are then untreated. So treated in the middle, untreated, and then they continue to do that. This has shown in multiple studies that this reduces the cost of control and the amount of insecticide used to bring populations down to that 20-30% mark by more than 50%, which is pretty big when we think about the cost of this. And then the why would we do this on large acreage? Why does it matter? So grasshoppers consume up to 50% of their body weight every day in forage. If we think of that rate, and we think of the map we saw earlier in this webinar, 2.7 grasshoppers per square yard, right? That equals 12,971 grasshoppers per acre. Now, if we take that same 1 acre, let's say we put 69.7 grasshoppers per square yard on there, that's the same amount of forage loss as it is of 1 cow eating the forage on that same acre every single day, which is a lot. And that's how we wind up with a lot of devastation loss. This all data was provided by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. So this is why this one works really well for rangeland and pasture land specifically. You can do aerial spraying for cropland as well, but there's some better techniques that we'll talk about that. So continuing on with pastures and rangeland, because a lot of people ask, well, what is the common chemical they're going to use in the plains? It's typically dimilin, because it's the best economic option. It affects the molting process, and it's a chemical they ingest. So it's the least toxic application you can do because it has to be ingested. It has minimal impact on beneficial or non-target insects. And this is what is part of the RAT program, because on those non-treated areas, that's where you're getting that conservation biological control of predators that are eating the grasshoppers that are moving out of the areas you just sprayed. So that's a really big one because grasshoppers move as they forage. So this program goes along with that natural movement that grasshoppers exhibit anyway, which is how they move to find food. For things that are like pasture land and crop and ones that you're going to turn into a hay crop, broadcasting can work, but it can be a pretty expensive source of application. But we all know, if you haven't been listening, hay prices are about to jump up pretty high here. So broadcasting might not be an option that breaks the bank because you're going to be able to sell your hay for a pretty big cost. So just know that broadcasting works well if you're only going to do it as like a pasture that you're going to bale. If it's one you're just putting animals out to graze on, it doesn't really make so much sense from an economic standpoint. You really want to go more from this RAT program with either using an aerial sprayer or when you're using like on a side-by-side and doing that same level of treatment. And then in alfalfa, it acts a little differently than just like regular grass hay because they really go over after when it's blooming. That's really when they go after it. So in those early stages of growth with alfalfa, you won't probably see heavy defoliation on it like you would on grass. They're really going to go after it once it blooms. And then any seedling stands of recent planted alfalfa in the fall can also be really devastated. So you want to treat, if you're doing just pure alfalfa, before the majority of your species hit maturity, which right now, it depends on how fast your crop is going to grow, and you're going to have multiple hatching cycles, right? Which is why you're going to have to go out and scout. But if your alfalfa is not going to hit maturity until, late May, June, July-ish at the earliest, because of depending on our water situation, then that's when you're going to have to treat. So just know you're going to have to balance that between what kind of grass you actually have growing, if you're going to bale it, or you're just going to let it where animals are just grazing it naturally with what's growing. The other big takeaway I want to put here that has to do with pastures and rangeland is to watch out for blister beetles. Blister beetles are an insect that follow high grasshopper populations because they eat the nymphs. And the blister beetles don't hurt the plants because they're eating the grasshoppers, but there's 3 species of them that can become extremely toxic to livestock animals if they get killed and crushed in the baling process. So the way to deal with them is when you do your windrow and you're gonna bale, you need to fluff it out one more time to encourage the beetles to fly out so they don't get caught in the baler. Because a couple of these guys can kill a fully mature horse, and then there's a lot of other issues that come along with that. So just be aware of the blister beetles. The 2-striped and 3-striped blister beetles are the most toxic ones in our state. I know Black Forest had kind of a big deal with them last year. So if you're in like the Black Forest area, Douglas, El Paso County, you know, Callahan, things like that, I would watch your hay pastures pretty closely. And I even heard reports that they were in our eastern counties, like Lincoln, Elbert, places like that. Just keep an eye out if you're putting hay out. All right, cropland. So you can use the RAP program as well early in the season prior to harvest. That's like the biggest window, right, of when we can really spray with things. You can do this with planes or ATV sprayers. But really, you really want to focus on that early targeted intervention with hatching beds, which you're going to find along the margins of your fields, on roadsides, near ditches, things like that. This really helpful graph from Oklahoma State University shows you, for cropland specifically, what your number counts are where you're really going to need to apply. So this is really helpful. Again, this will all be available to you guys, but these are the numbers you're going to want to keep in mind for cropland because it looks a little different from rangeland or pasture land. So with cropland, you want to scout like heavily in late May, June to kind of see where you're at in a hatching cycle rate, because if it's where, you know, most of yours have already hatched, you're really just dealing with adults, you have some different options than if you're having half adults and now you're also dealing with another full set of hatching rates that you're going to have to manage. So those are two different items that you have to keep aware of. Carbaryl and Malathion baits on the field borders work really well for migration of nymphs that are coming from different properties. So really watch your borders, really protect those, put some application down. And then where are they the biggest issue? It's really row crops and small grains, which is a lot of our state. Their favorites are corn, soybean, and wheat, all types of wheat. And then damage is most often seen in the first 50 to 100 feet on the field border as they move. They can cause a lot of damage in corn. They can cause a lot of issues on the ears. So that, again, this is a long-term, full season management issue. This is not something you're going to be able to just treat once and ignore the rest of the year. That's just, it's not going to happen. Fruit trees and yard trees. So these are examples of peach trees. So for grasshoppers, again, you're going to want to need to know your species because some species of grasshoppers only stay on the ground. They don't actually climb up into the trees and do any tree damage. Other ones, the minute that their legs are strong enough, up they go, and they never really come back down to eat anything else. They just move from tree to tree and stay high up in shrubbery. So you knowing what species you have is a big deal if it's really going to have a huge enough impact on your trees of any type or not. If you do have grasshoppers that are affecting your trees, when they're young, before their legs are super sturdy, which is around that third molt for most of our species, you want to put bait out along the base of your trees because it's not going to affect the tree. It's not really, baits are like one of the safer options to go for other insects that can be around your trees, but it's going to affect your grasshoppers and they won't be able to get up in the trees. It's going to affect their leg development or it kills them once they ingest it. You don't have to worry about it. If it's at the point where they're already up here in the limbs of the trees, but they're still small, they don't have developed wings, right? You can still use baits. You can stick the bait on with a couple different like tree application glues and they'll eat the bait because it's where they're eating. If you just put it on the ground and they're already up in the limbs of the trees, they're not going to go back down for the bait. So you're going to have to put the bait where they are if that's what you're dealing with. The other big thing with trees is you want to fertilize them a little bit more than what you would do normally to give them a boost. And monitor for heavy defoliation because the minute they chew through all the trees, the fruit, whatever it is are on your trees, they're going to start burrowing through the bark. I saw it through the last 2 years where it didn't matter what kind of trees. Junipers, I saw it on pine trees, I saw it on a ton of fruit trees. They burrowed through the wood and completely killed these trees because they were so heavy in infestation levels that the tree is dead. It's standing, but it's dead on the inside. It will not recover. So giving them a little bit more food, watering them a little bit more heavily if you can, trying to give them a bigger boost to withstand that insect damage while you're getting some management is the best way to really protect them. If you have young saplings, you can put like mesh netting or screen over them, but that only works while they're young because then their teeth get stronger and they can eat straight through it. So just know that only works for a very small amount of time. Again, around that third, fourth molt stage, their teeth are too strong, they'll just bite through the mesh anyway. All right, home gardens. So basically, a lot of the same tips we've been talking about. Scout early, watch your property lines. You can bait around your property barriers if you're open to using chemicals. Don't let areas get too overgrown this year because that immediately attracts them. And then if you do mow, try to keep things at a certain height that will attract predators like praying mantis, dragonflies, even wasps. Wasps will go after dragonflies as well and are a good one to leave if you can, depending on where they're located on your property. The big takeaway that I hear all the time in home gardens is, and if you put it into Google, it says, oh, just use garlic. Garlic kills them. No, it doesn't. That's a misnomer. So garlic itself doesn't kill them. It works best as like a deterrent if you plant it because they don't like the sulfur or odor or taste. However, the caveat to this is with high population densities, there is not a single crop or plant that they will not try to eat. I've seen them eat through window screens. I've seen them eat through wiring in vehicles and side-by-sides. I mean, honestly, if there's enough of them, anything they can get in their mouth, they're going to eat. So, just be aware of that. And that's why this population dynamics is really important. If you want to do more of a deterrent, more organically, if you use garlic oil, that is what can have a higher deterrent and can delay their maturity. And if you spray that garlic oil heavily on the underside of the leaves, when they're nymphs, early nymphs, it can actually sterilize females, which is really cool. This was a study done a few years ago and was published as a publication and then has been sourced through the USDA. So if you can do this, early management, you really want to protect your crops, that is a really good way to do that. I will link the publication that tells you exactly the formula you need to do in order to make garlic spray. There are some essential like oils and plants that have been proved as a deterrent. It doesn't kill them. Is lavender, mint, cedarwood. They don't like the smell, they don't like the taste, and if it's low enough population management, they'll stay away. So if you can protect your yard, you can manage those populations, get them down to that 20-30%, and then use some of these other crops, they'll stay away, which is nice. A lot of people ask about neem oil as an organic option. Is it organic? Yes, because it's not man-made. It comes from the neem tree. However, spraying it is extremely deadly to bees and other pollinators. So if you're going to use that as an option in a home garden sense or to protect trees, you're going to need to do it when the bees have already gone back to the hive or you don't see a lot of active flying pollinators like butterflies, hummingbirds, stuff like that, because you will kill them on contact if you spray that and they're out and about. And then as far as like in a home garden, what are they most likely to eat? Again, this is very relevant to population dynamics. Their favorites are beans, carrots, corn, and lettuce. They least like peas, squash, and tomatoes. Doesn't mean they won't eat them if there's too many of them and they just need something to eat. They will still 100% eat those down to nothing. These are really good examples from Oklahoma State University that I wanted to put out. So here on the left side of the screen shows you different plant species, and then whether for grasshoppers, they're preferred, slight damage, not preferred. And again, like juniper says not preferred, but again, population dynamics, right? Heavy enough numbers, they're still going to eat it anyway. This is a longer list than what I could put on this screen, so I'm going to just put this link in the email so you guys can look at this if you're a home gardener. And then they also have this nice insecticide list that is based on home garden use. This is not things that are necessarily best for like cost and application use. If you're a big crop producer, I wouldn't necessarily go off this list because some of these they don't make in the quantity that you guys would actually need based off your acreage. I see the question about why NOLA Bay isn't longer available. They had a really big fire at their factory a couple years ago, and because NOLA Bay it has to grow, it has to have time to mature. That fire devastated all of their stores. There is nothing left, so they have to start over from scratch. So even though the people were safe, the ones who know how to make it didn't get injured in the fire, it takes quite a few years for them to build back the ability to release that. So I know they're in the process of it. I have not heard that they're, again, anywhere near releasing that. It would be great if they would, but there's been no publication from the company or anywhere else about when or if that will ever become available again. So yeah, that fire was really devastating and really took away a really huge source of way to impact them. But Semaspore still exists. So if you find items that say Semaspore, it works a lot like NOLA bait. It just has some different applications. So just know it, but it's also a biological. So just know Semaspore is what you can still look for. You just won't be able to find NOLA bait. All right, so really quick, talking about baits versus sprays. These are our active ingredients you want to look for. So regardless of how big your property is or what type of plant you're going to spray it on or bait it on, these are the chemical ingredients you need to look at. And I make that a point because if you are like in a small acreage setting, a home garden setting, there is a common brand name. It's Seven. That's the trade name of all their products is Seven. However, not every Seven product has, typically they have carbaryl in it for grasshoppers. Not every Seven product has carbaryl. If it doesn't have carbaryl or some of these other items in it, it won't kill them. So don't fall for the brand names. You have to look at the active ingredients. Eco brand, all types of eco brand have, it's typically carbaryl. It's like a wheat bran base that's then has it's like 2% carbaryl in it. This one will work. So just know that's kind of what you want to look for. Baits are less toxic than sprays when you're trying to figure out like, you know, how soon do I have to go away from my harvest date, whether that's vegetables or fruit or hay. If you have livestock animals that you're going to put back into pasture rotation, you know, you're going to have to look at those withdrawal periods because it's typically about 14 days for most of these ones. Some of them are a little longer. So just really make sure you know what that is. Google is your best friend for these different chemicals of knowing when you can put things back out. And then I just want to say that sprays have the same level of mortality regardless of density. Baits work best when there's low density and they're younger. So baits work best when you are dealing with nymphs that are in low density at like a hatching site or, you know, whatever. And you can get a lot of them at a pretty good rate. Sprays are really your best option when you're dealing with those that are higher up where, you know, you can't stick the bait. They're in the trees, whatever. And you just really need to knock down that density more than anything else. That is a good option for sprays. So that's a good one. So I just want to show that not every species is, because like if you're like, oh, baits are maybe the way I want to go, it's just less toxic, it sticks around less. They're also, baits go away after it rains. So anytime there's precip, so if you put bait down and then we get those heavy rains in May, just know you're going to have to go back out and apply your baits, okay? This is also, again, where you need to know your species because as you can see, there are quite a few species here on this list that really don't eat the bait. Like best case scenario is you're only going to get 0 to 30% at best with some of these, which you're wasting your money at that point. Some of these others are a lot higher. Like if you're okay with that, you know, expected average around 42% for these other ones here, and then maybe these are the only species, the ones here in this really high sensitive range, great, go for the bait. Know your species, look at these, know what to apply. Otherwise, you're just wasting your money, whether you're doing this organically or non-organically. All right, so just a real quick talk about ecological impacts of baits and sprays, because it's a common question I get. So with sprays kill by contact and by them eating it. But it can kill a lot of like canopy dwelling insects like spiders and bees, because unfortunately, when we talk chemicals, there is not a specific grasshopper spray or bait. It affects it based on insect order, which means it's going to kill everything that has a similar body style, body shape. It's going to affect them. So just be aware of that. The biggest impact with sprays is on vegetation. Know when to spray, know when to and not to spray, like specifically with bees. With bait, you can kill some of the arthropods on the ground, like pill bugs, which are the roly-poly guys. You can have a small impact on ant colonies. It's not been highly documented. You can affect some other like beetle species, but typically not. They typically avoid a lot of it. And because it's a bait, grasshoppers can smell super well. Grasshoppers are pretty good about eating the baits, and like EcoBrand, it only lasts for like 21 days, so it's not a huge length of time where this is staying super toxic in the environment anyway. For sprays, it depends on what chemical you're spraying, of how long it stays active in the air. Most of them don't stay active like just in the air once you spray it. It's only active when it's on the plant or you sprayed it on the grasshopper itself. And then when you're thinking, okay, I'm going to use bait or sprays, you have to know when to use them based on grasshopper behavior. So a study in the Dakotas found that grasshoppers spend their early mornings basking and just hanging out. They're not eating, they're not actively moving until it hits 81 degrees, and then they start feeding. This is because grasshoppers don't have a really great way to thermoregulate. So they have to go out and bask like a lizard or a snake for a while to get up and moving and get their joints moving. So if you go out and you're trying to find a bunch of them and you can't, and you apply it really early, you're just wasting your money because you're going to hit a spot that they're not at anyway. And if you're going with a spray that purely kills by contact, it won't work because you're not getting them anyway. So you're going to have to know that 81 degree Fahrenheit like break point. They do stop in between feeding sessions and resting cycles. So no, they don't feed constantly throughout the day. They eat for a while and then they take a break. And then they eat a while, they take a break. It's like if you're at a football game, football party, you're not going to sit there and eat wings for the entire football game, right? You're going to take a break from the wings and probably go eat some chips and salsa and some other snacks. Grasshoppers are the exact same way. The other big thing is they're going to stop eating once temperatures hit above 95 degrees. For most of us in our state, that's going to start happening really fast and early in our morning. So you're going to have to attack them either early in the morning or later on in the afternoon once it goes below 95 degrees, because then they take shelter, they stop eating entirely, and they find somewhere to hang out, and they just won't eat. So 95 degrees is your cutoff point, and then they won't eat if it's super windy, like 15 miles per hour, which isn't too windy for us here in Colorado, but it's windy for them. If it's a cool, cloudy day, they don't really eat a whole lot. And then if rain is imminent, so if it's going to rain that afternoon, they're not really going to move around starting like around 11 or 12. So just know that you might want to wait a day or something, especially if we get those El Nino, that super El Nino impact in about a month or so. You're going to want to keep a close eye on the weather and your temperatures to know when to apply things. And then just know that for most of like the big scale producers that might be watching this or on this now, you're really going to be sticking in this chemical biological means. You can do physical and mechanical by protecting those field barriers, by mowing, by, you can put out some deterrents, you can put out some different cover crops that will deter them from coming on. But really for your money and protecting your assets, you're really looking at this chemical biological set. For those of you that are home gardeners, or maybe you just have trees, like just regular trees that are not fruit trees, you can kind of, again, stick in this lower part of the pyramid if you do management controls pretty early on. But if they get too heavy, your only option is really chemical. So just know with grasshoppers, you're going to need to know this IPM scale and know when you need to address it and go higher up depending on acreage size, what kind of crop you're trying to protect, and then just how bad is your infestation. Really quick, a quick discussion on natural options. So there are a lot of biological controls that will go after grasshoppers, like ladybugs, lacewings, robber flies, praying mantis are all really good ones. Dragonflies will go after them, but you have to create an environment that they're going to want to stick around in and keep hanging out. And you also have to remember, grasshoppers aren't the only bugs they eat. So you want a heavy population of these different types of predators in order to actually have them have a good effect, okay? And you can do that. They all have different needs that they need as a species. So Extension has a lot of fact sheets on these different types of insects and how to encourage them naturally. So just keep that in mind. Wild birds are another good way to do that, especially if you have pasture land and you're trying to do this more organically. I would say that you want to aim for birds that have larger beaks, because grasshoppers have a natural defense by using, it's a tar-like substance that they spit out, and it can shut small birds' beaks shut for a couple hours, which is why you'll see the little birds like finches, songbirds, they rip a leg off or take a wing off, but they don't actually eat the whole grasshopper. It's because they don't like the taste. It's very gross, it's smelly, it's sticky, and it shuts their beaks closed. So you really want birds that are bigger in size, that have that bigger beak, that can either handle that, or at least when they stab the grasshopper, they're going to rip it apart more and do more damage. I see the question about chickens. Chickens will eat grasshoppers, but they get tired of them. So if you are constantly making them go after grasshoppers, in about 2 weeks' time, they're going to give up. They're not going to go after them. Ducks and guinea fowl actually do way better from a poultry standpoint for grasshopper management than chickens will. However, if you keep your chickens like closed up in a pen, you only let them free range for maybe like a couple hours a day, and then you bring them back into the pen, that 2 weeks will extend out because it's just part of their normal free range behavior. So it kind of depends on how often are you keeping your chickens cooped up versus just letting them free range. But if you really want to get birds, poultry birds that will do better, ducks and guinea fowl, are the way to go. Turkeys will eat them, but they won't really go after them all that much. Mechanical controls, we've talked about this. It's those barrier plants. It's mowing. Know your water timing, because again, when they're young, you could flood them out, but you're gonna have to know where you're at in your life cycle, right? Because if they're at a certain stage where their legs are strong, they'll just climb or hide, and it won't really bother them. We won't talk about egg disturbance because that's more of a fall and winter item. And then there's some other safe applications you can do from a natural perspective. You can make a bait bucket. That is 10% molasses, like heavy, thick, liquid molasses, and then 90% water. This is not age specific, so you can do this treatment at any time, regardless of what life cycle you're dealing with. They can smell really well. So again, they smell the molasses, that's what attracts them, and the viscosity difference between the molasses and the water is what kills them. The only difference with the bait bucket is you want to make the bucket relevant to their body size. So if you were dealing with small nymphs, you don't want to use a 5-gallon bucket because they're not going to be able to get in. It's just not going to be useful. You want to use like a dog bowl dish or some other small container that they can crawl into and fall into. As they get bigger, you can make the container bigger. A lot of people ask, does this attract a lot of like bees and things like that? It actually attracts more wasps than anything else. So you could wind up dealing with a lot of wasps at a certain time of year more than bees. But if that's a concern, just put that away somewhere where that's not too much of a concern. If there's a lot of wasps moving around in that area, maybe it's an area you're just not in a lot. Epsom salt does work. It's a digestive killer, and you want like what I call non-flavored. So if you go to the store, you can get ones that have like lavender and all this stuff in. It doesn't work as like a double hitter if it's got lavender or mint or whatever in it. You really just want plain Epsom salt, and then you can just put it around because they'll eat it if they're in high areas. It really only works on nymphs though. So again, those early stages. You can turn it into a bait by following this formula, and then you can also put it as a spray, which can kill on contact as well. But again, only when they're nymphs, doesn't work when they're adults. And then diatomaceous earth, the food grade kind, not the pool grade kind, is what you want to get. It does reduce nymph mobility. It affects them from them feeding on it, and it dries them out. So that works really well. And then white flour, regular white flour, if you sift that on contact or on the plants where they're really heavily eating on them, this is really focused more on our home gardeners, it can gum up their mouth when they're small, and eventually it can starve them or encourage them to move on at the very minimal. So those are some options. I do have another larger webinar that goes into more natural options in way more depth that I will leak. So again, what do, right? I threw a lot of information at you. So the biggest thing is you want to scout early and often, every single month. It's the whole season, not 1 month. You can't just do it 1 month and think, oh, I know exactly how my grasshopper populations are going to go. No, because if you don't know your species ID, you're not going to know how many hatching cycles you're going to have. And depending on what happens with our weather in the next month or so, it could be less, it could be more. Kind of got to get it out there and see what's happening. Look for hatching sites. I was on a ranch literally just yesterday, and everywhere I went on her ranch for a good part, I was like, oh, you don't have any grasshoppers. This is fantastic. Until I had to walk through a ditch area, and then I found a hatching site, and they were everywhere, easily in like the hundreds of thousands. And I was like, oh, you need to treat this immediately because you're trying to have pasture land for your cow-calf operation. So go out there, look for hatching sites. It's areas where there's really thick grass that you couldn't mow because maybe it's a ditch, maybe you just couldn't get a mower in there, whatever. Those are the sites you're going to want to look for. If it's a dried up retention pond, if there's just a lot of leaf litter, that's where they're going to come out of. The higher the temperature it is, the faster they're going to pop out of the eggs, and then they're going to grow faster. So keep an eye on that. If you were at higher altitude, this is where that question earlier from the chat, it's around like 7,500 feet, give or take, is like the range for them. You're only about 10 days behind for most of our species in hatching cycles. So if you're up in Westcliff, Manitou Springs, you're up in, I'm not thinking like Vale, Aspen, anywhere up there like on I-70. If you are not seeing them yet, but your friends down below are, you have around 7 to 10 days before yours are going to hatch. So keep that in mind. And then hatching wise, it's air temperature and also soil temperature. It's not just air temperature. So if the ground is warm, the air is warm, and those first 0.4 inches of soil, that's when you're going to get a lot of movement. That's when you're going to get a lot of hatchings. That's just when they're going to be active. Okay. We already talked mowing. We talked about the kill, capture, measure method. You need to ID, and then know your management plan now before they really get busy. Don't wait until, I wouldn't even wait till the end of May, because we are seeing them spreading out so much right now throughout the state that you need to have a plan in place of if you're going to buy chemicals, if you're going to bait, are you going to do natural, how many do you have? You know, maybe you don't have any right now and you just need to monitor for the next couple months. You need to get out there and start making plans now, because when they start getting heavy in the next month or so, then everyone's going to be buying bait. Everyone's going to be buying chemicals, right? And you may not be able to get anything. So just know you need to prepare now, not later. So don't panic, just organize and attack. So that is the quick down and dirty. We do have time left. We have about 15 minutes left here. Like I said, I will put everything that I've done in the past, all of these fact sheets, these different items I brought up today in that email you guys will get next week with this recording, along with this, with all these slides. And then I just want to briefly talk about the GIS project. So because this has been such a need for the last couple years, and there is nothing that the state has that allows them to do landowner surveys, which means we're not getting an accurate picture. We can't see where hotspots are. We can't really do much from that perspective. And then conservation districts can't get the funds they need in the fall because they don't know that the spring's going to be bad for your area. I am working with another center on CSU campus where we are putting together a GIS project for landowners, meaning you can be a landowner anywhere in the state of Colorado. You can take a video of how bad your population dynamics are so we can see what that's looking like, and you can put a pin on your address, meaning then we'll be able to tell you, based on what we're seeing in the video, the species you identified, the life cycles, how far that spread is going to be, what crops they're most likely going to impact, and then any other further recommendations we have for you. And then we can also give it on like a larger county-wide basis, which is really helpful for all of you. So those of you that have signed up for this webinar, once that's live, I will just send you a courtesy email. It's completely optional. It's not required or anything, but it's a really helpful tool, not only from the university side, but it helps USD APHIS keep funds in their Grasshopper deal, and they are going to help fund this project because, again, it's the only way that we can manage them from a larger scale perspective, okay? I do have a quick survey that just has a few questions, just because I'm trying to do more population tracking now, early in the season, to look for outbreak centers, and then also this data you give in this survey from this webinar also helps fund further projects. So I'm going to stop screen sharing here for a moment so that I can put that in the chat. And then while I am doing that, you are also welcome to unmute and ask questions if you have any. And I will also be looking at the chat as well and make sure that I didn't miss any questions that I didn't address. So if you have a question, please feel free to unmute and ask away.
Beth, I have a question for you. You were talking about nymphs that overwinter, so you're already seeing fairly good-sized grasshoppers out there. If I'm seeing really tiny nymphs right now, does that mean they came from eggs?
Yes, that does mean they came from eggs. So if you're seeing like the little guys that are like the size of your thumbnail or smaller, maybe a little bit bigger, those are ones that came from eggs. Those are not the overwintering ones. Overwintering ones are about this big. So the ones that are bigger and like are super close to like being able to fly, or they can jump really far away from you, those are the ones that would have overwintered as nymphs.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, this is Patty from Chaffee County and Fremont County. Do Epsom salts have to be reapplied after you water?
It depends on how heavy your water application is. So if it's an area where it's getting like super doused with your irrigation or however you're watering, yes. If it's where it's just sprinkle and it just got a little wet, you don't have to reapply. Same thing if it's like rainfall, same thing applies. If it's a heavy rain that was, you know, short burst, but it was heavy, or if it's like a light rain, but it was all day or at least for a couple hours, you would probably need to reapply it once everything's dry.
Okay, and do Epsom salts affect any beneficial insects or any other insects besides grasshoppers?
It can. Same thing like where it's like the roly-polies. If you have, we do have some Colorado cockroaches, things like that. It can dry them out. It will affect crickets a little bit, but it's pretty minimal. So it's not a huge loss. You might have a few casualties of other insects, but not to a point where you're affecting other population dynamics.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
One more question. Can the same be said about the molasses and water combination?
If that gets like, if more water gets added to it because of, it rained or whatever, your sprinklers hit it, as long as you still have about 10% molasses in there, you don't have to like make a new bucket. You might just have to add more molasses if a ton more water gets added to the bucket or bowl or whatever you're using for that. As far as like other insects, it's really anything that will be attracted to sweet items. So it's more heavily in wasps than it is in bees, because bees are more after the pollen. It's only if your bees are really hungry, then they're not finding those early, plants that they can feed on, like dandelions, things like that, that they might be going for that as a food source. But if that's the case, you might want to just try to talk with beekeepers in your area and say, hey, like, I'm going to bait for grasshoppers. I don't want to kill your bees. I can tell they're really hungry. Is there a way we can do this safely so I don't get a lot of your bees and cause that kind of issue?
Thank you.
I see the question about, she says, if we find Mormon crickets in our area and they haven't been reported there before, is there a good place to report them to? You can report them to both myself and the USDA APHIS state person. I will put his email directly in the chat, and I will also put mine since I took that slide off. But yes, please report it to at least one of us, because we do need to know, and I work with him pretty closely. So, and it's helpful if you can send pictures and or video, or both would be great. So you're welcome to send this to both of us, and we can put that in there, because it does mean that we do need to get out there and add you to the map for 2026. So that way we can especially see how far they're spreading, because they can be a really, really big issue. Okay, I see last year I tried to buy Dimilin but couldn't find anything except a product for ponds. Can ordinary people buy it without a permit, and is the pond stuff acceptable? The pond stuff you saw, was it liquid? I'm assuming it was liquid form, or do you remember what the name of it was liquid? Okay, do you remember the brand name that it was under, like just the brand name of the product? Knockout Plus is one. Okay. I'm just seeing here. Let's see. Sorry. I'm not familiar with that one, but as long as it has the active ingredients, and like the active ingredient is Dimilin, you could still hypothetically still use it. But because it's made for pools, I would say that it's probably meant that it's also, it might have less of a usability life on land because it's made to be in an aquatic setting. And if you are near a waterway of any kind, or a pond or anything like that, you probably want to be careful with it, because it has more susceptibility to get into our waterways and cause issues downstream. So I would say, yes, you could still most likely use it. You might just have to use a little bit more of it because it's meant to be in an aquatic situation where grasshoppers are not. And then buying Dimilin without a license. So she's talking about a pesticide license. So for some chemicals in our state, you have to have for you guys, it would be a private pesticide license. If you are doing this for other people and getting paid, you have to have a commercial one. I know on some cases you have to. I think it comes down to quantity for some sources of Dimilin. The testing is pretty free. You can come to different extension offices across the state to get that if you do need it. But if that's where you're like, I really want to go after Dimilin, I want it in this quantity that I know I license for, I would tell you to get that now, instead of waiting until you really need it in June or July or later on in the year. And then I see, is it true that grasshoppers are attracted to the color yellow, and then it's best to use yellow trays or buckets for molasses traps, or try sticky traps for home gardens? So they can see color extremely well. Does it have a true attractant value to them? It depends on the species, and the color yellow for grasshopper species in general actually comes because they're really triggered by the smell of bananas. The those of them across the world that can become locusts, they have found that if they add the smell of bananas to like baits or different things, they come in massive swarms, and it's quite a sight. I don't know more of the research behind that of why bananas trigger them so much, but they do. So I don't know. You would have to know like what species it is to know if it like, and you can just try it by observation. If you're like, I don't necessarily know if I have all the species that like yellow, you can definitely try it and see if it attracts a lot more of them. And if it doesn't, then you probably have species that just don't necessarily have that strong of a color coordination with what they're eating. Any other questions? And as far as color goes, there's more studies done on like actual locusts than grasshoppers, just because there's not been a huge correlation in like how they see as far as plant varieties go, like what we see in pollinators for bees and things like that. That's not quite how their eyes work. So they're more heavily associated with smell and taste than they are with visuals from like a management perspective. So just things to think of when we think of how they perceive the world. I'll just give it a couple more minutes here in case you guys have other questions. Please take the survey. It again just helps with data funding and being able to kind of track population dynamics. I did put that again in the chat. It's just a quick little survey. Putting molasses out, because the molasses in the water, the viscosity is what kills them. Like bananas is just purely an attractant. But with, bananas will rot. They will attract a lot of other critters that you may not want, because they can smell that. So molasses is probably the better way to go. So you have like less other negative interaction with other critters, other insects than bananas. But if you, maybe if you can't find any molasses or you don't have a lot of it, you can definitely put some, you need to like open the banana. You can't just have it out there in its peel. It has to be like at least open and kind of smashed up so they can really smell it, and then it triggers them. So you can definitely use bananas to your use. But please don't do that at like a property line and push them all into your neighbor yard. Use bananas responsibly in grasshopper management. Any other questions, either in the chat or anyone who wants to come and verbalize a question? Thank you, Kirsten. I appreciate that. For those of you watching this later, she just, I will read it to you. It just says, amazing info. You are an expert on so many things. You think of unintended impacts and that it's appreciated. So, yep. Well, cool. Well, I will give you guys back the 2 minutes we have remaining. Again, this is recorded. I will post it, and then you all will get a very lengthy email from me with a ton of other resources. If there's something in those resources that still doesn't quite hit what you're looking for, or you have like another outside question that just isn't addressed in any of those, please feel free to just contact me. And I'm happy to chat with you more in depth on a particular question you might have about grasshopper management. So thanks so much for watching. Hope you found this useful, and continue to scout, go out, scout, manage early, and use all the tools in your bucket to control grasshoppers this year. So thanks so much. Have a great day, y'all.